Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 76, Unboxing Christmas Gifts. The next morning, Kyle awoke to find a small mountain of presents at the foot of his bed. Most were snacks, chocolates and sweets, and there were quite a few more than he'd expected. Being a good student really does have its perks, Kyle murmured, setting the snacks aside and eagerly moving on to the rest. Hagrid's gift was the largest, resembling a small wooden barrel wrapped in thick brown paper. Could it be a mooncalf? He wondered with a mix of hope and dread as he carefully unwrapped it. Thankfully, it wasn't. Hagrid had given him a lady's mantle, the barrel serving as a makeshift planter filled with soil. Fresh dew on its leaves suggested Hagrid had just dug it up in the Forbidden Forest. In return, Kyle had gifted Hagrid a model of the dragon used during the Triwizard Tournament, a little figurine that could fly low, spit fire, and even move around. He was sure Hagrid would love it. Cedric's gift was a signed copy of Quidditch Through the Ages, with signatures from the Chudley Cannons. Kyle took one look at the team's signature and promptly set it aside with a grimace. Not my team, he thought with mild disdain. Cedric, on the other hand, would likely be thrilled with Kyle's gift to him, his prized, autographed bat from the Vimborn Wasps. He had even sent a special request to Mrs. Weasley, asking her to mail it for him. Mrs. Weasley had sent a reply scolding him for not coming home over the holiday and promising a good telling-off come summer. Kyle wasn't worried. A handmade apron and a stellar report card would ensure she forgave him without a fuss. Conna had knitted him a pair of wool mittens, each bearing his initials, and her knitting skill was surprisingly refined. They fit perfectly and would go well with the sweater Mrs. Weasley had given him. For Conna, he'd picked out a handbag enchanted with an anti-theft charm, practical and stylish. Fred's gift was a bottle of disappearing ink, and George's was a collection of chocolate frog cards, neatly stored in a transparent card holder. For them, Kyle had chosen Elementary Alchemy, a textbook from Bosbaden's alchemy course, hoping it would aid them in their recent experiments with playful inventions. His roommates hadn't forgotten him either. Mikkel gifted him a finely crafted gold brooch, while Ryan presented him with a wizard chess set. To his surprise, Kyle also found a present from a professor. Professor Flitwick had given him 2 thick notebooks filled with meticulous notes from Flitwick's own 1st through 3rd years, detailing his understanding of charms, a treasure for any magic student. Kyle felt a twinge of guilt, as he'd only gifted Professor Flitwick a simple amulet carved from mountain ash. In fact, he'd given small presents to every professor. Professor McGonagall received a golden snitch hat ornament, Professor Sprout, a tool maintenance kit, Professor Oren, an elegant walking stick, and Professor Binns, a humorous newspaper clipping titled Europe's Top 3 Wizarding Academies, Professor Perks. For Headmaster Dumbledore, he'd chosen 100 ways to knit woolen socks. And then, of course, there was Professor Snape. Kyle had felt it necessary to show his appreciation for Snape's recent attention, so he had sent him a crate of Sleekeazy's hair potion. He hadn't signed the gift and had gone through some effort to ensure it was anonymous, using a school owl to send it to the Owl Post Office in Diagon Alley, which would then deliver it to Snape's quarters. Though the process had been a bit complex, Kyle was sure it was well worth it. He could just imagine how deeply moved Professor Snape would be by such a thoughtful gesture. After carefully storing Professor Flitwick's notes, Kyle opened the last present, which was from Diana. Inside was a silver ring adorned with a crescent moon, and beneath it lay a short note: "This magical item allows you to apparate up to 3 times. If you ever find yourself in danger, just channel a bit of magic into it, focus on your intended destination, and it will take you there. Note, it cannot be used within Hogwarts Castle, but it will work beyond the castle gates. If you don't want to take the train home over the holiday, you could use it for that, too. I hope you like the gift, dear. Merry Christmas." Is this an upgraded version of a portkey? Kyle slipped the ring onto his finger, and it automatically adjusted to fit snugly against his skin. He flexed his fingers and found it entirely comfortable, without a trace of tightness. Kyle was delighted with the gift. He'd long wanted to learn apparition, but since he was still too young, neither Chris nor Newt had been willing to teach him. This ring was easily the best Christmas present he'd received in his 11 years. If only it had more uses, though, just 3. 30 would be much better. After tidying up his dorm room, Kyle made his way to the common room, where he spotted Conna standing on tiptoe, rummaging around in a large planter. "What are you looking for? Need some help?" Kyle asked. "No, I found it," Conna replied, pulling a dirty cloth bag out of the planter. Turning to Kyle, she added, "Thanks for the Christmas present. I really needed it." Kyle watched as she retrieved 2 galleons from the bag and then tucked them back into a small clutch. He frowned, puzzled. "Have you been losing galleons lately?" he asked. "No," Conna said, shaking her head. "But I lost 2 sickles yesterday afternoon." "Isn't that basically the same thing?" Kyle frowned. "Where's your roommate? Has she gone home?" "Yeah, they all went home. I'm the only one left in the dorm now," Conna said, a bit giddy. "But they did send me a gift, some hair clips from the Muggle world. They're so pretty." Kyle rubbed his forehead. He was about to respond when Conna dashed back to her dorm. When she returned, she held a small wooden box in her hands. "Look, aren't they beautiful?" Conna said, handing the box to Kyle. Inside were 7 or 8 colorful hair clips, each with a unique and distinctly Muggle style, unlike anything seen in the wizarding world. Kyle, however, wasn't particularly interested. He gave them a quick look and was about to hand the box back to Conna when something caught his eye, a tiny bottle nestled beneath the hair clips. Curious, he reached in and moved one of the clips aside. What is this?" Kyle's hand jerked, and he almost dropped the box. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he quickly set the box down on the wooden table beside him. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Kyle reached out and gingerly picked up the small bottle. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 77, Bitter Taste. The bottles were about the size of a thumb, each filled with a golden potion that shimmered like molten gold. After a moment of careful observation, Kyle became certain the bottle contained Felix Felicis. Felix Felicis, also known as the Liquid Luck, was arguably the most complex potion in the wizarding world. The rare ingredients were only part of the challenge. It took half a year to brew, with each step requiring painstaking precision. Any slip-up, and you'd have to start all over again. Each vial was worth a fortune. "Where did you get this?" Kyle asked, turning toward her. "Professor Snape gave it to me for Christmas," Conna replied, a bit unsure. "Why, don't you have one?" Hearing this, Kyle's heart sank with a twinge of envy. Snape hadn't even given him an empty bottle, let alone Felix Felicis. He swallowed his jealousy and, with a slightly complicated expression, asked, "Did you know Professor Snape before?" Conna shook her head at first, then nodded slightly. "I've heard my mother mention his name before, but I hadn't met him before coming to Hogwarts." Kyle studied Conna thoughtfully. "Prince." When Snape first gave Conna extra points, Kyle had felt something was off. He'd assumed they simply knew each other, so he hadn't thought much more of it. But now, it seemed he had misjudged. If they merely knew each other, even as friends, Snape would hardly gift Conna something as valuable as Felix Felicis. Malfoy never received such treatment. This hinted at a deeper connection to the name Prince. Kyle pondered this for a moment, feeling he'd heard the surname somewhere before. It was so familiar, but he couldn't place it. The only thing that came to mind was Princeton University, which had no relation to the wizarding world at all. After thinking on it for a while, Kyle gave up. He held up the small glass bottle and asked, "Do you know what this is?" "Cold medicine." Conna guessed uncertainly. Kyle shook his head and decided to be direct. "No, it's Felix Felicis." "Pfft, Kyle, you're still half asleep." For some reason, Conna burst into laughter. "It might look like Felix Felicis, but I don't even know Professor Snape." Why would he give me something so precious? It's impossible. Why not? Kyle said, giving the bottle a gentle shake. Is there any other potion that looks as much like liquid gold as Felix Felici's? Kanna shook her head again. Professor Snape is a potions master. It wouldn't be hard for him to change the color of a potion. Maybe it's a Christmas prank, and this really is cold medicine. Kyle tried to explain further, but Kanna found a reason to disagree each time, until eventually even Kyle began to doubt himself. He could understand Kanna's reaction. If he'd found this bottle among his own presents, he'd have trouble believing it was Felix Felici's too. He'd likely think Snape had brewed some unusual poison, dressed it up to resemble Felix Felici's just to trick him. In the end, it seemed that Kanna was convinced, deep down, that the potion was Felix Felici's, even as she kept finding reasons to argue otherwise. Somehow, it made sense. So Kyle let it go and didn't press the matter further. Determining whether the bottle held Felix Felici's or not was actually quite straightforward, or at least convincing Kanna of it could be. All Kyle needed was to uncover the connection between the surnames Snape and Prince. But first, it was probably best if he held on to the bottle. Kanna had a tendency to lose things, and this bottle might be next in line. If it really was Felix Felici's, she'd regret losing it. He glanced over at Kanna and asked, "Can I hold on to this for now?" Kanna clapped her hands indifferently. "Sure, you can have it." Kyle shook his head quickly. "Forget it. You'd end up crying and regretting it." Just kidding. He wasn't the kind to actually take advantage of a situation like this. He was just a tad less scrupulous than most people. "I won't cry." Kanna wrinkled her nose in defiance, sounding annoyed with Kyle's comment. "If I say you can keep it, then you can. I won't regret it, and I definitely won't ask for it back, even if you try to return it." Kyle shrugged nonchalantly. If he had a recording device, he'd have captured her words for later. He'd play it back in the common room on repeat when the timing was just right. After leaving the common room, Kyle headed to the library and stayed there until noon. The Christmas feast was lavish, with tables piled high with plump turkeys, mounds of roast meat and potatoes, platters of little sausages, buttered peas, and, oddly enough, stacks of pancakes. Scattered every few feet along the tables were magical holiday crackers in vibrant colors, a festive staple, like the Christmas tree itself. Kyle picked up one of the crackers in front of him and gave it a pull. With a loud pop, a lacy, tassel-adorned lady's hat drifted down in front of him. He glanced around, then casually slipped the hat into his moleskin pouch. Next year's Christmas gift for Professor Snape, sorted. Kyle continued to pull on several more crackers. Each explosive crack felt like a small burst of joy, with no worry of accidental injury, making it all the more fun. By the time the feast truly began, he had a small mountain of items piled next to him. There were 6 hats of various styles, 2 sets of wizard chess, 3 rubber wands, a collection of odd trinkets, and cockroach clusters. To be honest, Kyle wasn't sure if the cockroach clusters were real or not, so he kept them sealed in a clear box, well away from his other items. The house elves had, as always, worked culinary magic. Eyeing the enormous turkey, Kyle carved off a little drumstick, then used some stuffing and sausages to make himself a festive pizza. After the turkey, the Christmas pudding arrived, which held a small surprise of its own. Kanna's pudding came wrapped with a glint of silver sequins. Kyle eagerly sliced into his own pudding, only to find a hint of yellow inside. He put down his knife. No more cutting, it was mango sauce inside, and he didn't want it spilling everywhere. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 78, New Members of the Flower Garden. In the afternoon, Kyle made his way to Hagrid's cabin. "Kyle, what are you doing here?" Hagrid greeted him warmly, handing over a plate of rock cakes. "Thanks for the gift. I like it a lot." On the small table in the cabin, the models of the dragons were displayed carefully, and Hagrid had even set up a little fence around the table, as if worried they might fall. It was clear he was quite fond of them. Kyle shook his head, declining the rock cake. "Hagrid, I don't think I can eat another bite right now." "Right, I reckon you're already stuffed with turkey and sausages," Hagrid chuckled, taking a bite of one of his rock cakes. "So, what brings you here?" "I'll tell you now, though, I'm not taking you to the Forbidden Forest." "I'm not here for the Forbidden Forest," Kyle replied. "I just wanted to ask if you know wizards with the surname of Prince." "Prince?" Hagrid repeated, scratching his head as if the name rang a bell. He paused, then gave his head a tap. "Sorry, Kyle. I've had a bit of a cold these past few days, my head's all fuzzy. Can't seem to remember much of anything right now." Suddenly, he brightened. "Oh, right. Poppy asked me to go see her in the hospital wing after the feast." He stood up in a hurry. "Sorry, Kyle, I've got to go now. I'll send you an owl if I remember anything." "All right," Kyle replied, a bit disappointed, as he followed Hagrid out of the cabin. It seemed he'd have to wait until the holidays were over and write to Chris to see if he knew anything about the surname, Prince. Kyle wasn't planning on asking any other professors. Aside from Hagrid, he suspected Professor McGonagall and the others wouldn't share anything on this topic. If Prince really had some connection to Snape, they'd likely stay tight-lipped. Back in the castle, with little else to do, Kyle headed to the library and resumed reading the hardcover book he'd borrowed earlier that morning. It was a biography of a legendary duel master whose life was nothing short of astonishing. According to the book, he had never lost a duel since his first, and held the record for 200 consecutive wins, including 11 straight dueling championships. To this day, no one had broken his record, not even Professor Flitwick, who'd once managed a streak of 115 consecutive wins in his youth. However, despite the impressive subject matter, the biography itself left much to be desired. Complex aspects of magical theory, which should have been explained step by step, were glossed over in a few brief sentences. It felt like trying to solve a math problem where, instead of showing the steps, the author simply handed over the answer without any explanation. The book's vague language extended to the master's dueling advice. Though it claimed to offer helpful tips, the guidance was frustratingly ambiguous. For moving targets, lightly twist your wrist at the right moment when casting a spell. To extend the spell's range, tilt the wand slightly upward, but not too high, or it will go off course. Just follow your instinct. If you feel lost in a duel, ask your wand, it will guide you on the next move. Appropriate means finding the right timing. Trust your instincts. Kyle pondered, replaying the vague words over and over in his head. Though the phrases made his head spin, he was determined not to give up. Instead, he pushed himself to grasp what the author might be implying. With renewed focus, he practiced repeatedly in the room of requirement, hoping to make sense of the cryptic advice. This was, by far, the most time-consuming part of his training. Sometimes, Kyle would spend an entire day, or even longer, trying to understand a single ambiguous sentence. Despite the book's thinness, it took him until the end of the holiday to finish it. The day before classes resumed, Kyle headed to the library to return the book. Madame Pants took it from him, checked its condition, and set it aside, satisfied. As Kyle turned to browse the shelves for another book, a cool voice interrupted him from behind. "I'd suggest you stop borrowing these kinds of biographies." "What?" Kyle spun around, puzzled. Madame Pants sat at her desk, expressionless as she flipped through the pages of the book he'd returned. "This book's content isn't particularly complex, yet you've been reading it for 2 whole weeks. Clearly, it's not the right choice for you." Kyle was taken aback. This was the first time he'd seen Madame Pants go out of her way to address a student, especially about a topic outside her usual library responsibilities. Regaining his composure, he asked, "Are you saying my foundation is weak?" "No. Your foundational knowledge in magic is strong. Judging by the books you've borrowed, you're already ahead of many third years," she replied, her gaze steady. "But understanding the life and techniques of a legendary wizard requires both experience and depth of knowledge." Kyle bit his lip, realizing he had no real counterargument. He was only in his first year, and aside from his knowledge of magical creatures, his practical experience was admittedly limited. If you truly want to learn something useful, don't waste your time on biographies like this one. Madame Pants gestured toward a nearby shelf. I recommend you look over there. Kyle nodded and, without hesitation, headed toward the indicated shelf. If Madame Pants had gone to such lengths to guide him, it was probably worth a look. Besides, he hadn't decided on his next book yet. Who knew what he might find? He soon found that taking her advice had been a good decision. 5 minutes later, he returned to the counter with a thick tome entitled The Changing of Charms, Origins. Madame Pants's expression shifted subtly before returning to her usual neutral demeanor. After recording the loan, Kyle decided to bring the book back to his dormitory to read later. Today was the last day of the holiday, and he still had a few things to do. His first stop was the Room of Requirement. As soon as he entered, a group of soft, furry creatures crowded around him. 5 moon calves gazed up at him, their big, round eyes fixed on him. Kyle petted each one in turn and asked, "It's daytime, why aren't you sleeping?" One of the moon calves tilted its head and let out a soft coo. "Oh, you're afraid someone might come, so you don't dare sleep?" Kyle chuckled. "Don't worry, no one comes here except me." Reassured by his words, the moon calves returned to the little cave Kyle had created for them in the Room of Requirement. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 79, This Is All Your Fault. Gazing at the 5 moon calves, Kyle's mind drifted back to the events of last night. He'd been practicing charms in the Room of Requirement, and time had slipped away unnoticed. By the time he left, it was already late, and feeling a bit frustrated by the slow progress and repetitive motions, he decided to take a walk before bed to clear his mind. Exiting the castle through the tapestry-covered secret passage on the first floor, he initially intended to stroll over to the Quidditch pitch. But, lost in thought, he wandered in the wrong direction without even noticing. When he finally looked up, he realized he'd somehow ended up near the Mooncalves' den. Perhaps this was meant to be, he thought. Since he was already there, it made no sense to leave empty-handed. These were the same moon calves he'd carefully snared from the Forbidden Forest before, so catching them again wouldn't be difficult. Moon calves, gentle and magical creatures, had been wary of Kyle at first, retreating into their burrows upon seeing him. But when Kyle began to dance awkwardly in the moonlight, they couldn't resist their curiosity and started poking their heads out, one by one. Seeing this, Kyle only wriggled around more enthusiastically. He'd learned this technique from Newt, and while he wasn't nearly as skilled, his imitation of the Mooncalves' dance was convincing enough to earn their trust. Kyle was only a beginner at this, so his performance was passable at best. If Newt had been the one dancing, he would have charmed a whole herd of female moon calves. It was almost ridiculous how talented he was. But Kyle had to admit, this kind of dancing was embarrassingly silly, which was exactly why he'd waited until it was late and there was no one else around. Otherwise, he would never have done it. Absolutely never. After dancing for a short while, Kyle saw the moon calves warming up to him, coming out of their burrows, one after the other. He offered them some herb leaves and gently coaxed them. Maybe because they were used to Hagrid, the moon calves in the Forbidden Forest were far less skittish. Once Kyle promised them all the Dittany leaves they could eat, the 5 little gourmands trotted over, unable to resist. Kyle had originally intended to take just 2, but as he looked at their big, shiny eyes, he felt it would be wrong to leave any of them behind. In the end, he simply decided to take them all. After all, it was just a bit more herb leaves, he could handle that. The whole process went surprisingly smoothly. With a few whispered reminders, the moon calves kept quiet and followed him obediently out of the Forbidden Forest. The real challenge, however, was getting them back into the Room of Requirement. Kyle's invisibility cloak was only big enough to cover one mooncalf at a time, so he had to lead them in one by one through the tapestry's secret passage. By the time he delivered the last mooncalf, dawn was approaching, and his legs felt like jelly. He sank to the floor for a moment, catching his breath. But it had all been worth it. With 5 mooncalves in tow, the problem of fertilizer for his plants was solved. Kyle took a moment to observe the 5 little creatures. Although they seemed slightly nervous, that was to be expected. As long as they didn't start pining to return to the forest, they'd likely settle in just fine. After leaving the room of requirement, Kyle headed to the kitchen to pack some food for Hagrid, who still hadn't shaken off his cold and looked worn out. "I brought you some scones and sausages," Kyle said, setting the food on a shelf. "Thanks, Kyle," Hagrid replied gratefully. He lifted a brass kettle to pour Kyle a cup of water but spilled about half of it, a little frown crossing his face. "Never had a cold before," he muttered, handing Kyle the cup. "Yesterday, Poppy gave me a huge bucket of potion to drink, and it tasted awful." "Nothing you can do about that, it's all part of being sick," Kyle replied, taking a sip. "How are you feeling? Any better?" "Worse," Hagrid said, shaking his head. Yesterday, he'd only felt slightly dizzy, but after drinking the potion, he felt achy all over and had barely any energy left. It was clear that this state was getting to him. Kyle, looking at him in confusion, asked, "Didn't Madame Pomfrey give you a pepper-up potion?" Pepper-up potion was the go-to-cold remedy in the hospital wing. He remembered Cedric and Ryan taking it when they had colds a while back. Though it made white smoke come out of their ears, it kept them alert and strong enough to keep up with classes. "Pepper-up potion? No, that's not what she gave me," Hagrid said after a pause. "Poppy said it wouldn't work right for me. She gave me some other sort of magical potion, but I don't know what it was." Realization dawned on Kyle. Of course, with Hagrid's massive build, a standard pepper-up potion or any regular cold remedy wouldn't work effectively. As he thought this over, a curious idea came to mind, and he glanced again at Hagrid. The dazed, sluggish way he looked reminded Kyle of something he'd seen about a year ago. An erumpent in Newt's case had caught a cold, and after Newt gave it a specialized potion, the creature had displayed a similar groggy state. This. Kyle pressed his lips together thoughtfully. He had the distinct feeling he'd stumbled upon something quite remarkable. The train arrived as scheduled, pulling into Hogwarts just before dinner. The castle was lively once more. As soon as Fred and George returned, they tracked down Kyle. "Why didn't you tell us you weren't going home for the holidays?" Fred demanded, fists clenched. "Mom took her anger out on us when she didn't see you. She thought we were bullying you," George added, his expression sour. "She didn't even look at us kindly the whole holiday. Do you have any idea how we spent the past 2 weeks?" Fred continued, his voice growing more indignant. "On Christmas Day, even Ron got to have turkey and sausage, but George and I had to make do with dry sandwiches. This is all your fault." With mock-serious faces, the twins cornered Kyle, their expressions implying, "You're not leaving until you explain yourself." "I told you before break," Kyle said, raising his hands defensively. "It was the day before we left school. You two were on the 5th floor corridor, looking at a suit of armor." "The day before we left school?" Fred echoed. "The 5th floor." George repeated, their faces showing a sudden flicker of guilt. They recalled that they'd indeed been on the 5th floor just before break, and they had run into Kyle there. But at that moment, they'd been more focused on the password clue for the Marauders map they'd discovered behind the armor and hadn't given Kyle's words much attention. The two exchanged a glance, as if silently reaching an agreement. "It's still your fault, you could have written." "Yeah, 2 weeks of sandwiches can't be forgotten that easily." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 80, Sweet Talk. Faced with the threat of 2 second-year students, the not-so-formidable Kyle had no choice but to verbally agree to a series of one-sided agreements to avoid any potential campus bullying. "Remember what you promised, Kyle," Fred said with a grin. "You're going to be our technical support for the Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products. And provide storage," George added. "We need a safe place to keep it over the holidays, somewhere Mum won't find it." "Of course, I'd be happy to help," Kyle replied with a smile. "I'll even help you work on the products. And as for the storage, how about my room? Mrs. Weasley will never think to check there. Perfect, Fred and George nodded approvingly, relaxing their hold on him. If you ever try to double-cross us, Fred warned with mock menace, you won't like the consequences. With that, the twins simultaneously held up a thumb and made a mock slashing motion across their necks before heading off. Once they'd left, Kyle casually made his way to the Hufflepuff table, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. How was your holiday? Cedric asked as Kyle sat down. Not bad, Kyle replied, glancing at Cedric. No early mornings, no homework, just reading, gardening, petting animals, that sort of thing. Basically, the life I've always dreamed of. Cedric sighed a little enviously. If I'd known, I wouldn't have gone home. My dad promised to take me to France over the holidays, but he's been so busy, working overtime almost every day. He's barely even home for 5 hours at a time. Kyle was surprised to hear this. It didn't add up, hadn't Chris and Newt successfully handled the smuggled magical creatures? And he hadn't heard of anything major happening in the wizarding world recently. In fact, the front page of the Daily Prophet had recently featured only trivial things, like that spat between Mr. Weasley and Lucius Malfoy at the Ministry of Magic. In a time of relative calm, Mr. Diggory should have had time off unless there was some kind of emergency involving magical creatures. And if there had been such an incident, surely the Daily Prophet would have reported it. Cedric noticed Kyle's confusion and, after a quick glance around to make sure no one was eavesdropping, leaned in and whispered, "It's about the swooping evil. My dad's been searching for signs of it." Swooping evil. Kyle frowned, whispering back, "Didn't that thing leave already?" "No, the ministry is lying," Cedric said. "Dad had a few drinks on Christmas Day and, thinking I was one of his workmates, let slip quite a few things. He said the ministry never actually found any evidence of the swooping evil's departure." Kyle shook his head. But that's not what Newt said. He'd believe Newt over anyone else on matters involving magical creatures. Newt was the last person who would lie about something like that. The only conceivable reason Newt might withhold information would be if it were a serious threat to the safety of the wizarding world. And even if pressured, neither Fudge nor Dumbledore would likely ask Newt to withhold the truth. Well, at least Dumbledore wouldn't. Fudge, that might be a different story. Unless, of course, Fudge happened to be Dumbledore's own son. "I asked about that too," Cedric said. "My father told me Mr. Scamander's exact words were, 'We didn't find any swooping evil, it's probably hiding,' but the ministry only gave the Daily Prophet the first half of the quote and left out the second half." Huh? Kyle raised an eyebrow. "To avoid panic?" "Yes, to avoid panic," Cedric replied with a shrug. "They even found a way to get rid of Mr. Chris and Mr. Scamander, who had both always opposed this kind of thing." Kyle rubbed his chin thoughtfully. His earlier doubts were starting to make sense now. No wonder he'd felt something off about Chris's mission this time around. So that was the issue. After all, if it was just about transporting a few magical creatures, why would Chris and Newt both need to go? Sure, handling creatures like the Nundu or the Antipodean Opali would be tough for most wizards, but for those two? It seemed excessive. But what about the other creatures? The simple ones, that could be released in any secluded forest, or handed off to a couple of hired hunters for transport. Yet, somehow, it had to be Chris and Newt handling them. Think about it, a deputy director from the British Ministry of Magic and a renowned magical creatures expert traveling halfway across the world, just to return an ordinary bowtruckle to its home. That was absurd. Under normal circumstances, not even a bowtruckle belonging to Grindelwald himself would get such treatment. After considering this, Kyle asked, "So did your father actually find the swooping evil?" "No," Cedric shook his head. "He and the others have been searching for over a month without finding a single clue. But Minister Fudge keeps pushing them and even lost his temper recently." What a jerk. Though Cedric usually maintained a polite demeanor, he only mouthed the last word silently, demonstrating all the restraint expected of an exemplary young wizard. However, His lip movements were distinct enough that Kyle could tell Cedric was expressing his opinions about Fudge's family line in some rather colorful language. After indulging in that small rebellion, Cedric felt a bit better. He cast a quick glance at the staff table and said, "Anyway, never mind all that. Have you noticed that Professor Snape seems especially irritated today?" "Really?" Kyle picked up a chicken leg, not even looking up. "Maybe it's just your imagination. He's mad every day." "True, but..." Cedric glanced again toward the staff table. "I still think he's even worse than usual." On the stage, Snape indeed looked as if he'd drunk the wrong potion, his expression dark as a storm cloud. His eyes swept ominously across the 4 tables, narrowing slightly as if in search of some wrongdoing. Suddenly, as if sensing Cedric's gaze, Snape turned sharply toward the Hufflepuff table, causing Cedric to drop his head immediately. Meanwhile, Kyle calmly continued to eat his chicken leg, occasionally chatting with Mikkel, who was seated on his other side. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.